Welcome back to Axis of Truth, and today we're exposing the truth about the Iranian opposition. After all, everyone's asking, if not the Islamic Republic, then who or what? There absolutely is a viable alternative to the Islamic Republic, but as of now, only one. Now, one of the biggest lies being told about Iran right now is that there are many figures in the Iranian opposition, and that the West needs to somehow hear from all of these figures and options before deciding if they're going to throw support behind someone. Now, this entire approach rests on false premises because those claiming to be alternative opposition are not, in fact, opposition at all. And here's why. Take, for example, the Mujahideen, also known as MEK or NCRI in the United States. They're a Marxist Islamist group that previously was on the terror list in the United States. They're very loud, they're very well funded, especially in their network of groups that operate outside of Iran, and they have no shortage of lobbyists. Inside Iran, however, zero legitimacy. In fact, they're on par with the regime itself in terms of how hated they are. Now, it's crucial to understand that, contrary to how they present themselves, the MEK is not a democratic opposition movement. Former members have described how it operates like a cult. And in the 1970s, they carried out assassinations of American military and civilian personnel in Iran, including U.S. Air Force officers and a U.S. Army lieutenant colonel. Now, after the 1979 Islamic Revolution, the MEK supported Khomeini and publicly backed the U.S. Embassy hostage crisis. MEK was also responsible for the trashing of the Israeli diplomatic office inside Tehran, among other groups, during the revolution. Only after losing power to the clerical regime did they turn their violence against the Islamic Republic, after first helping them overthrow the Shah in 1979. In 1981, the MEK also carried out a series of bombings that killed senior Iranian officials and civilians. And when they were forced out of Iran, they didn't turn to the Iranian people, they turned to Saddam Hussein. The MEK was based in Iraq for decades, funded, armed, and protected by Saddam. And they even participated in his war against Iran. This is just one of several reasons that the MEK is viewed inside Iran not as an opposition group, but as a traitorous terror group. The 2026 JNS International Policy Summit is coming up April 15 to 17th at the Waldorf Astoria in Jerusalem. It's shaping up to be a phenomenal few days, and we'd love for you to join us. Visit jnssummit.org to register and take a look at the speaker lineup, including me. It's a top-level group. Hope to meet you in Jerusalem this April. While polls in Iran are, of course, limited, those that have been conducted show less than 1% support among Iranians inside of Iran and less than 6% amongst Iranians abroad. So why do they keep coming up in discussions of opposition? Let's talk about how the MEK operates today. The group is under the absolute control of Maryam Rajavi, who calls herself literally Iran's president-elect, despite no one electing her. Now, former members have described, as I mentioned, the MEK as a cult that practices forced divorce, forced celibacy, family separation, psychological and physical abuse, and in some cases, forced sterilization of women, according to reports. Former members have also testified to sexual abuse and coercion by the leadership. Now, today, its most devoted members live in a compound known as Ashraf 3 in Albania, isolated from the outside world, while their leadership lives comfortably in Europe. And how are they able to sustain all this? Money. The MEK has poured millions of dollars into buying legitimacy. They paid hundreds of thousands of dollars for speeches from American politicians and even former officials such as Rudy Giuliani, John Bolton, and even former Vice President Mike Pence. They've spent at least $5.1 million on lobbying firms just to get delisted as a foreign terrorist organization in the United States. And they also push legislation in the United States claiming to support a free Iran, but explicitly endorse MEK's 10-point plan from their front group in America, the National Council of Resistance in Iran, as I mentioned, NCRI. Now, the NCRI functions as the MEK's political arm and its liaison to Western lawmakers. They intentionally misrepresent themselves as being somehow representative of Iranians, leaving lawmakers confused as to their lobbying access and that they actually have popular support from Iranians. Any support for MEK, in fact, ends up empowering groups that Iranians reject. But what about alternatives inside of Iran, right? Let's talk about the other fake opposition, reformists. Today, in the international media, we're hearing a lot about so called reformists, such as the president of the Islamic Republic today, Masoud Pezeshkian. Now, what's important to understand here is that there is no such thing as reforming in the Islamic Republic. The mullahs even create fake opposition so that the regime always ultimately stays in control. And that's why Pezeshkian is the president in the first place. When international pressure on the Islamic regime increases, so too does the discussion of reforms domestically to improve, supposedly, the situation for the people. Now, the problem is that there are never actual meaningful changes. It's a tactic demonstrated for 47 years. For example, when the regime murdered 22-year-old Kurdish Iranian Mahsa Amini, they discussed loosening hijab laws. Well, there was pressure. But the second that everyone continued with the news cycle internationally, they actually passed a crackdown on the mandatory hijab. And this is why Iranians, from left to right politically, are almost entirely united today against the idea of reform, because it's simply not possible under the Islamic regime's system. Reformists are a managed faction within the Islamic Republic designed to preserve the system. That's why figures like Mohammad Khatami, widely considered a reformist, never challenged the guardianship of the Islamic jurist, the system, which rules the decisions of the regime. Reformism exists to buy time, to calm protests, to convince the West that the regime can somehow be fixed. Every major protest wave has proven this to be false. Now, here is the key question. If the MEK is a cult, and reformists serve that regime, who actually has the legitimacy to lead a new and free Iran? The answer is the person that the Iranians keep risking their lives to support, and the person that MEK and the regime both will do anything to try to take down, Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi. Now, it's critical to understand that this doesn't mean a monarchy is being imposed on Iran. In fact, this is one of the most dishonest attacks used against Iranians and the Crown Prince today. He himself has consistently said he's in favor of a democratic transition, and he doesn't want to be king. He said explicitly, including in my interviews with him, that the future system must be decided by the Iranian people alone in a referendum, and that he looks to examples of constitutional monarchy or parliamentary monarchy as examples. The reality is that transitions require trust and coordination. They require a figure who can unify, communicate, and protect a path to a democratic process. We're also talking about a region that isn't like the West. They don't always have the same level of civic advancement that democratic states might have. Take Egypt, for example. Abdel Fattah al-Sisi is no champion of civil rights, but he's dealing with terrorist insurgencies constantly. Does the U.S. refuse support as a result? No, because he is advancing stability in the region. So why this pretend facade of the West not wanting to formally endorse and back the Crown Prince as a transition leader in a free Iran because of democracy? This is a prime example of Western stupidity and hypocrisy. Here you have a leader that's pro-West, who wants to reform Iran into a friendly, democratic country, who has the backing to unify a fractured, broken country, who doesn't even want to be king, and you're hesitating? Contrast that with the stupidity exemplified by the West on Syria. They're propping up a former terrorist to take over the country where he is already mass slaughtering minorities, but not a word from the same democracy advocates that are so hesitant about Iran. And I'm sorry, but if the Iranian people actually did hypothetically end up choosing a full-on monarchy, who is the West to tell them otherwise? Why can we accept monarchy for all kinds of U.S. allies in the region, including, by the way, gross human rights violators like Qatar, but for Iranians, it's unacceptable? This is imperialism. And if the West really cares about democracy, then they should be throwing everything they have behind Reza Pahlavi. Iranians shouldn't be required to meet a higher standard than any other people fighting a dictatorship. So here's what should be done. Stop platforming the MEK and its front network. For lawmakers, stop confusing lobbying with legitimacy. Follow the money when you see voices that are obsessively bashing the crown prince. And most of all, listen to Iranians inside Iran and respect their right to choose their own future. That is what real solidarity looks like, and that is the truth about the Iranian opposition. For years, Iranians have been saying something very simple and very uncomfortable, that the National Iranian American Council, NIAC, does not act like a neutral community group. It acts like an unofficial lobby for the Islamic Republic of Iran. Now, for a long time, that claim was dismissed as angry rhetoric or exile infighting until this week. This week, a regime official went on a regime-affiliated political talk show and said the quiet part out loud. Take a look.
مطابق سبک خودمون که سبک خودمون چی باید باشه من شما میشینیم بعداً صحبت می‌کنیم الان
به سبک خودمون به سبک خودمون تریت پارسی بود دیگه دکتر
حالا بله
اون لابی که گفتید رو خیلی خلاصه در حد 30 ثانیه میگم. ببینید اعراب لابیشون آدم محوره، میرن با کوشنر میبندن. اسرائیلیا لابیشون ساختار داره، نظام داره، پول داره، بودجه داره، آیپک داره، سیپک داره. این اسرائیلیا عرب اون شکل میرن. واسه ایران اینها مقدور نیست. واسه ایران این اجازه رو نمیدن، نمیشه. لابی شما رفتید ساختید اونجا نایاک رو، آبرو و شرف ایران و ایرانی رو بردن اونجا. اصلا آبروریزی اونم که شد برجام شکست خورد. والا به خدا نسخه‌ای که میپیچید خیلی ضعیفه و جواب نمیده.
You created a lobby called NIAC. Oops. Well, what we saw here obviously was them accidentally, because this is being recorded, implied that, of course, Trita Parsi, the co-founder of NIAC, and NIAC itself were both part of the regime's network. Not opponents, not outside actors, part of the system, which is what they've been accused of for years by Iranians. Now, that moment matters because it gives context to what we've been watching, particularly since protests broke out inside Iran in December. Narrative warfare, especially on social media. So when those protests began, the regime didn't just respond with executions and mass arrests. It responded with a full-scale information war spearheaded by the IRGC's cyber forces. Since December, the Islamic Republic has been running a coordinated disinformation campaign through these cyber units aimed primarily at foreign audiences. Yes, you. This was not random online chaos. It is a deliberate strategy and one they've used before. IRGC-linked networks activated large clusters of accounts across X, Telegram, Instagram, and YouTube. These were not all obvious bots like with flags and spam bios. They were designed intentionally to look believable. They posed as Western left-wing activists, as anti-war campaigners, human rights commentators, and even concerned Iranians calling for caution. And the point was plausibility. The messaging was remarkably consistent. Identical phrases appeared across unrelated accounts, warning of a Syria-like scenario, claiming that the protests were exaggerated or limited, directly accusing the US and Israel of supposedly orchestrating these protests, and insisting, of course, that there was no real alternative to the regime. This was not organic debate, it's coordinated message deployment. Just as important, this campaign was built for you, not for Iranians. The content was written in polished English and aimed at journalists, at policy analysts, at influencers, and regime violence, of course, was downplayed. Executions were cast as unconfirmed, and the very clear and public calls for Reza Pahlavi that were on the street across Iran were accused of being AI. At the same time, the risk of war, state collapse in a war that drags in the US, and regional instability was heavily exaggerated in all this content to create fear and hesitation in Western audiences. A core part of this strategy was also division. IRGC-linked accounts spent a disproportionate amount of time smearing Iranian opposition figures, and by that I mean Reza Pahlavi, especially those gaining international attention. The attacks on Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi followed a very familiar script. He's a foreign puppet, monarchy is a threat, he has no real support inside Iran. The goal wasn't to win an argument, but to create doubt and confusion, especially in Western leaders. And this is where NIAC and Trita Parsi re-enter the story. For years, both have pushed public positions that coincidentally align with the exact same regime objectives at precise moments. During major protest waves, including 2019 and 2022, when Iranians were calling for international pressure and accountability, NIAC focused its energy on opposing sanctions, opposing isolation of the regime, and warning that supporting the opposition was dangerous, even whilst Iranians were being butchered by that regime. Literally, when Iranians were being shot and executed, NIAC was lobbying against measures that would weaken the regime. And its co-founder, Trita Parsi, has consistently framed Israel and the United States as the primary drivers of instability, while consistently downplaying the role of the Islamic Republic itself. He has also repeated many anti-Semitic conspiracies claiming Zionist control of U.S. policy and other weird Jew-obsessed conspiracies that closely mirror the regime's own rhetoric. Now, this matters because when IRGC cyber networks push a message and that same message shows up in NGO statements, media, op-eds, and panel discussions, it creates an illusion that this is what Iranians think and feel. But it's not. You're seeing a carefully curated reality built by bots, amplified by useful idiots, and laundered through respectable-looking platforms. When you're convinced the protests are small, divided, or too risky to support, the regime buys time. And time is its most important weapon. This is why narrative warfare matters. Bullets silence people, but the narratives, they can silence movements. And the only remedy to that is education. We have to learn how coordinated inauthentic behavior works, to question identical talking points appearing across unrelated accounts. Pay attention to who benefits from these messages, and stop confusing NGO branding and representation and access with legitimacy. Above all, as I said before, listen to Iranians inside Iran, not the voices that consistently ask you to lower expectations, delay action, and accept the status quo. And now to wrap up the good, the bad, and the ugly. I actually have an amazing, not just good story for you today to start us off. Everyone has been talking about the Super Bowl ad from Robert Kraft's Blue Square campaign, but if you ask me, this is what the Super Bowl ad should have been. Check it out.
A story over a decade in the making, Israel bobsled. 3 months ago, 5 Jews, a Druze, and a Shiba Inu took Israel to the ice to fulfill an impossible dream.
Some call them shul runnings or the little sled that could. Truly just an inspiring run for a team that has made the impossible possible.
A story that can be described as only in Israel. Blood, sweat, tears, and a massive dose of never say never.
Bobsled's band of underdogs now standing on the cusp of Olympic history. Hard to believe.
Shul runnings. I absolutely love it. It's so cool. And I have to say, I know AJ, the leader of this bobsled team, he also was an Olympian in skeleton, and they've been working for this for 12 years. I mean, it's truly, truly inspiring and an Israeli story of heart and historic achievement at the Milan Cortina 2026 Winter Olympics. And Israel is indeed sending its first ever bobsled team, as we saw, to the games, a group of athletes who came from really unexpected sports backgrounds. Like, I want to add a few more comments about this just because it's so cool. They came from pole vaulting, shot put, rugby, even, as I mentioned, AJ, who previously competed in skeleton at the Olympic Games. He actually taught himself bobsled by watching videos online. And this team qualified after years of pushing and training abroad, paying for everything themselves. And this is what makes this really special, I think, for me, is that for the first time in history, a Druze Israeli is representing the state of Israel at the Olympic Games. And it's also the first time anyone from the Arab society in Israel has represented Israel in the Winter Olympics as well. So 2 different major milestones of inclusion and pride for the Druze community and for the entire nation. This team is doing what Israeli athletes have always done best, overcoming the odds and making their country proud on the biggest stage despite the odds. So wishing good luck to all of Team Israel and especially this amazing bobsled team, including AJ Edelman and all the team. We are with you. And today's bad story is a warning about a very real national security threat that's been happening here in Israel right under everyone's nose. Now, according to a new report, the Islamic Republic of Iran intelligence services have spent the last 2 years running a widespread recruitment campaign targeting Israeli civilians in an attempt to turn them into spies for sabotage, influence, and intelligence operations within Israel. We've heard about a few of them, but the Iranians are not only recruiting professional assets, they're throwing out small jobs and quick cash opportunities to cast a wide net and to get people to do simple tasks that could lead to much deeper compromise. They're using social media phishing, messages online, recruitment offers, and financial incentives to lure, in particular, adolescents, students, and even adults with no security training who think that they're just doing small tasks until suddenly they're helping an enemy state operate inside Israel. The goal is sabotage, influence, and undermining Israeli society from the inside. It's also a reminder, of course, that Iranian intelligence is constantly looking for ways to exploit vulnerabilities beyond missiles and military threats, and that the battle for Israel's security happens online just as much as it does on the ground. And finally, the ugly story of this week is from none other than the New York City Mayor Mamdani, who this week cited Islam, yes, Islam, as the reason he signed an order limiting cooperation with ICE. So much for separation of church and state, right? Take a look.
And I consider my own faith, Islam, a religion built upon a narrative of migration. The story of the Hijrah reminds us that Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam was a stranger too, who fled Mecca and was welcomed in Medina. Surah An-Nahl 1642 tells us, "As for those who immigrated in the cause of Allah after being persecuted, we will surely bless them with a good home in this world." Or, as the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, "Islam began as something strange and will go back to being strange. So glad tidings to the strangers."
So there's a few key aspects that the mayor failed to mention here. First off, Mamdani refers to the Hijra as his moral, backing for this new order limiting the city cooperation with ICE. But what is the Hijra story? Well, the Prophet Muhammad came to Medina from Mecca, where he faced persecution, and was welcomed by many there, including, of course, Christians and Jews who were there. Then, suddenly, the tone changed with permission for all manner of distasteful behaviors, from forced conversions to theft of property of non-Muslims to polygamy and sex slavery. After he built an army and slaughtered the non-believers, including the Jews of Khaybar, he incidentally returned to Mecca to conquer there too. So when Mamdani uses a story like this, or even uses the historical example of Islam, that's not a good thing. And let's not forget about the fact that when we talk about migration in Islam, a very generous term he applied there, historically speaking, we're not talking about immigration. We're talking about colonization and erasure of countless indigenous cultures in the Middle East and beyond. Islamic colonization took over and Arabized indigenous peoples across the region, and then went to tremendous efforts to rewrite history and present themselves as the victims, when in fact, they were the aggressors. This is gaslighting 101, and it's no wonder that we see such conduct from the charlatan of New York City, Zoran Mamdani. And with that ugly, ugly story, we wrap up this week's episode. But of course, we'll be back next week and later in the week with an exclusive interview with Shurat ad-Din CEO Nitzana Darshan-Leitner to discuss her critical work holding terror groups and regimes accountable in the courtroom. In fact, this week it was announced that the families of the victims in Majd al-Shams, the horrific attack by Hezbollah on a children's football field where 12 Israeli Druze children were killed, is suing Hezbollah for $25 million. Stay tuned for the interview only on JNS, and we'll see you next week on Axis of Truth.